What if the problem wasn't that something was wrong, but that something new had arrived? What if trying to fit old patterns into a new reality is exactly what causes the tension we feel inside? And what if Jesus wasn't just responding to a question about fasting, but revealing how change itself works? It started with a simple observation. A group of people approached Jesus, not with hostility at first, but with curiosity mixed with comparison. They said, "The disciples of John fast often and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours go on eating and drinking." On the surface, it sounds like a practical question, a religious question, a question about discipline and tradition. Fasting was an important practice, a way of seeking God, a way of expressing repentance, longing, devotion. And in their world, it was expected, structured, regular, recognized. So they were essentially asking, why are your disciples not following the same pattern? Why are they not doing what others are doing? Why does it look different with you? But beneath the question is something deeper: comparison. Because when people see difference, they often try to measure it, to align it with what they already know, to evaluate it through familiar systems. And Jesus responds, not by rejecting fasting, not by dismissing tradition, but by shifting the entire frame. He says, "Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while he is with them?" That image matters. A wedding, a celebration, a gathering filled with joy. And in that setting, fasting would feel out of place, because fasting is connected with longing, waiting, absence. But a wedding is about presence, about fulfillment, about something being here, not missing. Jesus is saying something simple but powerful. There is a time for everything, and right now, something has changed. The bridegroom is here. That means the season has shifted, but he doesn't stop there. He continues. The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. In those days, they will fast. So he acknowledges both realities. There is a time for celebration, and there is a time for fasting, but they are not the same, and they are not interchangeable. Then he gives two images that are easy to picture, but deeply meaningful. No one tears a piece out of a new garment to patch an old one. Why? Because it creates tension. The new fabric doesn't match the old, it doesn't blend smoothly, it pulls, it distorts, it damages both. Then another image, and no one pours new wine into old wineskins. This is more than just agriculture or storage. In that time, wine would ferment and expand. New wine is active, it moves, it grows. But old wineskins are rigid, they have already stretched to their limit. So, if new wine is poured into old skins, the pressure causes them to burst, and both the wine and the container are lost. Jesus is not just talking about fabrics and containers, he is talking about how people respond to new reality. Because something new is happening in front of them, but they are trying to understand it using old frameworks, old expectations, old systems. And that creates tension, because new life cannot be contained by old limitations. New movement cannot be fully explained by old categories. And this is where the message becomes deeply relevant. Because we do this too. We try to fit new seasons of life into old thinking. We try to understand change using familiar logic. We try to hold on to what is shifting. But Jesus is pointing out something important. Some things are not meant to be simply adjusted. They require transformation. He concludes with a simple statement. And no one after drinking old wine wants the new, for they say the old is better. That's interesting, because it acknowledges resistance. Familiarity feels safe. What is known feels reliable. What has been experienced feels trustworthy. Even if something new is better, it still feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar often feels uncomfortable. So people tend to prefer what they already know, even when something new is being offered. This is not just about wine, it's about mindset. About openness, about readiness for change. The question is not whether old things are bad, or whether tradition is wrong. It is about whether we can recognize when something new is unfolding, and whether we are willing to receive it. Because what Jesus is revealing is not just a teaching about fasting, it is a revelation about transition, about how God's work moves, about how seasons shift, about how life changes shape how we respond. The disciples were not fasting in that moment, because they were in the presence of Jesus. They were living in a unique moment of history, a time of fulfillment, a time when something they had long waited for was present. And that changed their response. But the question from the observers reveals something about human nature. We often evaluate new things through old comparisons. We measure change against what used to be normal. We expect continuity in forms, even when the substance has shifted. And Jesus is gently challenging that approach, not by rejecting the past, but by revealing that the present has a different meaning. The bridegroom is here. The presence of Jesus changes the atmosphere, changes the expectation, changes the response. And that means not everything will look the same. Not everything will operate the same way. Not everything will fit old patterns. This is where the metaphor becomes very personal. Because new wine represents something active, something growing, something alive. And old wineskins represent structures that cannot stretch further. They have reached their limit. And when you try to force new movement into old capacity, something breaks. That breaking is not always visible at first. It can appear as frustration, confusion, resistance, or even conflict. But underneath it is misalignment between what is growing and what is fixed. Jesus is inviting them to recognize timing, to recognize season, to recognize that not everything should be held in the same way. There is wisdom in discernment, knowing when to hold, and knowing when to release, knowing when to continue patterns, and knowing when something new requires a different response. The challenge is that change often feels uncertain, and uncertainty makes people reach for what is familiar. That is why the phrase, "the old is better," is so powerful. It is not necessarily objective truth, it is emotional security. But security does not always equal direction, and familiarity does not always equal truth. Jesus is not dismissing fasting, he is reframing its place. There will be a time for it, but not every moment is the same moment, and not every season carries the same expression. This teaching invites reflection. Where in life are we holding on to old frameworks when something new is unfolding? Where are we trying to apply familiar patterns to unfamiliar situations? Where are we resisting change, not because it is wrong, but because it is different? The wisdom in this passage is not about rejecting tradition, it is about recognizing movement. Because life is not static, seasons shift, understanding deepens, growth requires flexibility, and sometimes what is needed is not more control, but more awareness. Jesus uses simple imagery so that the deeper truth is not missed. Because everyone understood garments, everyone understood wine, but not everyone understood timing. Not everyone understood that new things require new space, and that is the core message. New life cannot be contained in old limitations, not because the old is useless, but because it was not designed for what is coming next. The invitation is not to discard everything, but to discern what is needed now, and what belongs to another season. That kind of awareness requires humility, it requires openness, it requires willingness to let go of assumptions, and it requires trust that what is unfolding has purpose. The conversation begins with fasting, but it ends with something much bigger, a lesson about change, about transition, about recognizing movement when it appears and responding accordingly, not with resistance, but with understanding. Because when new wine arrives, it is not meant to be poured into old limitations. It is meant to be received in a way that allows it to grow, to expand, to become what it is intended to be. And that is the invitation hidden within this moment, to recognize what season we are in, to understand what is being introduced, and to respond with awareness, not just comparison, not just habit, but discernment. Because sometimes what looks different is not a problem to fix, it is a new reality to receive. Thank you for watching this video. If this message spoke to your heart, don't forget to like, follow the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.